Due to social distancing, the ability of children and families to access traditional face-to-face social networks will be hampered, and new means may need to be explored to retain contact as an important protective factor. This is why we're here today, to try and develop a shared space to think about new ways of retaining contact with some of the most vulnerable people in our society. As professionals and organizations, we've had to rethink almost everything. And very quickly, everything has changed, which means we have to do things differently. And these webinars are our way of trying to create a shared learning space, to begin to think together about ways of doing things differently. We as a panel here are learning too, and this can be very painful, frustrating, and very uncomfortable at times. But it can also, if we allow it, can bring forth creativity and innovation, which is going to allow us to continue working safely, sensitively, and attentively to the most vulnerable children and families in our societies. And the reason for this webinar really is that we have people on the panel who've been doing this work quite quickly, quite intimately, and quite innovatively with people who are really on the edge at times. And we would very much value their perspectives, their discussions. Each of our speakers will speak for approximately 15 minutes, after which time we will open the discussion to participants. I am now going to hand over to Gema Hadridge, who will be starting our webinar discussion today. Gema is a colleague of mine, and she works with me at the Anna Freud Centre for Children and Families as a therapist for the Early Years Parenting Unit. She's a Social Work England registered social worker and has worked across a range of settings in health and social care services. She's previously worked in adult inpatient services on high and medium secure wards. She is also trained in mentalization-based therapy, MBT, and is currently completing the advanced MBT supervision to become an accredited MBT practitioner. She has completed level 1 and level 2 of TheraPlay, which is an accredited training for working with parents and their children who have experienced developmental trauma. Gema, over to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gema Hadridge, and I work at the Early Years Parenting Unit with Nicola and other colleagues. And what this means for us, that just over 3 months ago, and those that were in the seminar yesterday have heard this already, we went from 2 days a week as a therapeutic community, 5.5 hours each day with multi-family work happening, so different families for that whole time, to overnight being told we can't go in for our safety, for the family's safety, and having to work out how we could try and translate this work online and digitally. So kind of first of all, how we had to do that is we looked at our crisis plans that we already had in place for the families and amended them. We wanted to make sure that people had everything they needed to keep safe, knew where to look, because these are families that might not have been reading the news, might not have had access to tablets or phones to be able to keep updated, and also might not have been aware of the health implications in a way that we were. So we shared that, but also the social side, the isolation, ensuring there was plans that were actually possible when all services around them shut down. One of the things that I found really helpful, and why I'm so glad Aaron and Amanda are here, and I'm going to reference both of them throughout, is actually thinking about the data implications of what we were asking. So when we first opened up what kind of platforms we'd be using with them, we used the ones they were already using. We knew that it would be very difficult for them to start using Teams on day 1 of lockdown and different ways of downloading things. So we wanted to ensure it was free, that they had internet access, but also, and this is where I can thank Amanda for this, ensuring they knew the data implications. Just because something says it's secure doesn't mean your data isn't being used for something else. And wanting to ensure that we don't miss that ethical side of what we were unable to protect in the same way when we were working in person. But also the reality, they were now in a home with their children where there weren't spaces for them to have individual time with us or with other people. So we were having to ensure that actually we weren't asking too much of these families. We weren't able to offer therapy in the same way. We weren't able to be doing parent-child work in the same way. And we were having to really think on our feet about what we could do. So initially, and throughout the last few months, there's been some surprising benefits where we've had a new insight into their home life. We've seen their home twice a week rather than every few months, because we would do home visits, but not that regularly. We've also seen it helped some of the people that struggled to be in those one-to-one sessions. The distance, the being there, but the not literally being in the room with us, meant that there was more space for them to feel safe to talk. And I had one moment that with one of the mums I worked with, I was talking with her and her children were playing in the background. And I asked her what they were doing so I could hear them. And she span it around from selfie mode into non-selfie mode so I could see the children. And we had a moment of observation of her children that we'd never managed before. And we do video work, so this isn't the use of video, it was the us observing the same thing. I literally had the same view at her at the same time. And we were able to wonder what was going on for her children in that moment in a way that, as I said, we hadn't managed before. So these kind of things were great. And what we were able to build, but we didn't rush into, we were really mindful of not rushing in, because actually sometimes this isn't better or equivalent to what we were offering in real life. We started doing community meetings, and we were surprised by how much the parents engaged virtually with the space with the other families to talk together, to be able to talk about how lonely they felt or how frustrating it was to not being able to take their kids out to parks, or just how actually they were quite annoyed and just wanted to be able to go outside at points. And so these were things that we wouldn't have been able to predict or expect, and were actually beneficial. I also know that some of my colleagues have been cooking with families in ways where they've had the tablet set up and they've been able to do these shared activities, being able to play together in a way that, again, we would have never predicted, but that actually we are talking about children we have relationships with already. In the context we work, we're talking about safeguarding of children and of adults who struggle with their mental health. And so although there were these benefits, we also were left feeling very helpless on occasions where we were worried about the adults or the children. It felt like we were left sitting with even more uncertainty, not just because there was an uncertainty of COVID, but actually we weren't able to intervene in the same way, nor were the social workers that we worked with. The children that are in school weren't in school anymore. And so it also did mean there was less monitoring of the families that do need those spaces for the children and the adults to have check-ins, to have a monitoring space. And as Aaron said, and I'll let him go into it more, the important thing of just not assuming it's a functional equivalent being in this space, that you can't just assume that you're getting the same thing. I also know that it wasn't always easy. Some of the children I've worked with have found it very difficult to see us in our home spaces, where they've shown us their bedrooms and they've shown us their home, and it's all been very exciting. And then they've got very, very upset that I wasn't going to give them a tour of my home, that I was actually not with this background. This is a different background than I have when I'm with the families. I wasn't going to give them a tour. And with some of the families, it's taken weeks to work out whether actually we can even still work with the children in that way. Also for the parents, one of the mums said the same thing. I get it, I want to see your home. I know I can't, but I'm now in that unboundaried way that I know I'm in your home space. And one of the other things as well is actually when we have those lovely moments, and we have the moments where we're able to have connection, singing together with the children, or having a joke with the parents, and a moment of connection, actually still having to hold on to the uncertainty that we don't know what happens when the phone goes off. We aren't able to contain in the same way. And so I'm just going to summarise briefly, because I want to ensure that we go on to more the digital working that Amanda and Aaron can share. But I think for us as a team, what we ended up focusing on is ensuring that whilst we're working digitally, we had to recognise that we can't offer the same thing. And our focus was offering connection, offering a sustained relationship, offering more practical support than we would normally in our role. We did, but it was definitely an increase. For example, buying headphones for a mum that's phone was breaking and she didn't have the money, and it meant we either couldn't talk to her or we had to buy her headphones. That kind of way of working we wouldn't always do. but also trying to focus on moments of joy. So this, I feel like a children's entertainer at times, getting my guitar out, getting books out, buying different books that I know the children I work with like, that I wouldn't normally have at home, but we had on the unit we work in. These ways of trying to create this shared experience still. But it's hard. The parents we work with, this is the stuff they struggle with, to contain themselves and contain their children. And it takes a lot to sit down, have a camera set up, and be able to manage even 5 minutes, let alone sessions. And so what's also we're realising is we just can't do the work. We're left really worrying about what's going to happen once this all opens up again and normality comes back. And that means the real importance of doing multi-agency working, thinking with other professionals, hence this space, to work out how can we work together now and going forward. And it really reiterates the mutual reliance we have on other networks, that we can't do this work alone. Us as therapists, as social workers, as many other practitioners, how can we come together to try support each other? Just practically make sure all the services aren't making phone calls on the same day, so we're not overwhelming the families with all the things we're doing. The new ways we have to make sure as a network we're not overwhelming each other, to not send too many emails, but that actually we do have to check in more often because we're not able to monitor in the same way. And I think just ending on how important it is to have a team around you to do this, whether that's in an informal way because of the team you have, or whether it's in these kind of shared learning spaces and thinking together. What we have on the unit is we have a WhatsApp group for the therapists and other people in the team where we can text and say, I just need a check-in with someone afterwards. We'll have more meetings than we would have normally, just to make sure that we're checking in, keeping them brief, because that in itself can become unboundaried where we're processing something and actually we do need to work out how to contain ourselves too. And I think that this is the thing that's hard, that we're actually having to manage something that is more complicated, but we're also left alone more whilst we're doing this, especially if we have children running around and we're not in homes that are set up for doing this work. And so what I kind of want to leave on is that we are able to do something, but it's not the same. And that there is a decrease in social services referrals. There's a different way of referrals to therapeutic services at the moment, but we know that doesn't mean there's a decrease in harm and trauma that children, families and adults are facing. And so although at the moment we know we're having to wait and slow down and hold, we're having to stabilise something that isn't stable. It's really difficult, and that's why we're really looking forward to the discussion of this. So yeah, I'll hand over and I'll come back in the discussion if there's any further questions about the actual work that we've been doing.
Thanks very much, Gema. I mean, I was kind of struck thinking, because of course Gema and I do work together, and how far I've been pushed out of my comfort zone, things I've never had to challenge, that my personal space, my home is inviolate. I don't have to talk about that, and yet I do. But it's not that I have to be pushed into then capitulating, but how do I start to manage these kinds of questions, queries, therapeutic spaces in a different way? And I thought that was really, really important, this trying to find a stable balance for our clients, but also for ourselves as we try to negotiate this new way of doing things. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Aaron Balick. Before I do, can I just remind people to turn their videos off so that we could make, so this technologically it just goes a bit easier for us. Okay, Aaron Balick is a psychotherapist, a cultural theorist, a media consultant, an author and director of StillPointSpaces International, which is an organization devoted to the psychological exploration of contemporary society. Aaron has a particular interest in the psychology of technology and has written extensively on this subject. And it was at one of Aaron's seminars that Gema found so helpful that really provided the impetus for this webinar itself. Aaron is a leading voice in the media on psychological issues and has been a regular voice for mental health content on BBC Radio 1 and BBC Radio's 4, The Digital Human, as a presenter on CBC's Life Babble, and co-presents the Seeking the Self podcast with Natalie Nahai. He's written for The Independent, The Guardian and The Huffington Post on issues to do with psychology, mental health and technology. Aaron is an honorary senior lecturer at the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex, and he is the author of The Psychodynamics of Social Networking, Connected Up Instantaneous Culture and the Self, as well as the illustrated children's self-help book, Keep Your Cool, How to Deal with Life's Worries and Stresses for 11 to 15-year-olds. His most recent book is The Little Book of Calm, Tame Your Anxieties, Face Your Fears, and Live Free, which is also available in audiobook. Aaron, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. Can everybody see my screen now? Okay, thanks for that. I think just for a little bit of transparency and why I'm here, I'm not crazy about working online, and I always feel like I need to kind of share with people that this isn't my passion, and a little bit of the context about how I sort of got roped into it. And it was really around the book of the psychodynamics of social media, which is really just applying psychoanalytic theory to Facebook and Twitter and social media. It's not really about what therapists and clients should be doing in relation to their social media use. But this sort of turned into this interest in applying psychoanalytic ideas to technology, naturally started to feather into people who are working online more and more. And in the early days, when I first got involved with StillPointSpaces, they were a small international organization of insight and depth-oriented therapists who were mostly expatriates in various countries across the world. Many of them doing trainings in Zurich. There were a lot of Jungians to start out with, so they were doing trainings in Zurich, and created an online counseling platform as a matter of expediency, because they were traveling a lot and they were seeing clients abroad, and how can we make it easier and how can we not do it on Skype? However, I think somebody might need to mute their computer. I'm hearing a lot of duct tape being unwrapped or something. So because we were sort of depth-oriented therapists, we felt very responsible for taking a critical approach to how we were going to be doing this online work, and then carried out a pilot project.
Aaron, I'm going to interrupt you quickly. I wonder if people, we can hear some noises from somebody's room or computer. If you could just remember to mute your microphones and turn off your videos. Sorry, Aaron.
That's okay. I mean, it's parallel process, isn't it? Because these are the sort of things that we also encounter in the work. But the reason why I'm here today basically is I facilitated a year-long qualitative research project amongst our therapists who were working online to understand the psychodynamics of working online, not just the data implications of working online, which are equally important. And I'm going to be reflecting on that research today. Very quickly, this is usually a half day's training, so I'm going to be throwing I've condensed everything down. I'm throwing a lot of sort of facts at you. We can make this available for you, and the research is online as well, so you can read the longer version when you get a chance. So it's a time of necessity. Obviously, many of us have been thrown into this situation, but let's also kind of see it as an opportunity. And as Gema was speaking about before, some things are opening up in a way that maybe we didn't have access to. And I think we need to be thinking clinically and from a qualitative research perspective. What are we learning from this period where we have to move online? And when we move back online, can we not move back to the status quo? What might we want to bring with us? It's sort of like flexible working, right? We don't want to just go back to what we know, but go back to something different and further educated. Now, a great deal of the profession has had to move online without the experience of having done so before. And the big mistake that people have been making, as Gema indicated before, is somehow thinking that working online is the functional equivalent of working offline. I'm just moving my practice online. Should not be the way that we're thinking about it. Fortunately, there have been small groups of people working online more than 10 years now, and there are books about it, and we can draw on their wisdom. So for those of us that are new to it, we're 3 months into this crisis now. It's really time to educate ourselves about how to do it right, how to do it safely, and how to do it thoughtfully. So one of the people who's doing research in this, you might be familiar with her, Gillian Isaacs-Russell, wrote this great book, Screen Relations, which I highly recommend. And in this book, she says that on Skype, you cannot kiss or kick. And Skype is kind of the use-all word for working online. We wouldn't recommend Skype itself. But when working on video conferencing, you cannot kiss or kick. And anybody that is trained in the mental health talking professions understand that kissing or kicking in any case is something that we shouldn't be doing, even when we have the opportunity to do that in the consulting room, right? It's more the possibility that gets removed when we start working online. So how we work with transference, how we work with rejection, how we work with projection. These things operate differently when we move online. There is no danger of physical proximity, and we lose that whole anxiety-provoking, very rich area. And if we lose that, we have to become aware of that and work with that loss, and possibly also be working with some gains that we might discover. So we need to be asking ourselves, what is possible? So, you know, the obvious question is what becomes impossible when we move online? What becomes possible is a question we need to be asking. Seeing the inside of somebody else's house is one of those answers, and then seeing the inside to our house is another. Co-presence versus telepresence, really always being mindful that when you're co-present with someone where you could kiss or kick, even though you shouldn't, being replaced by telepresence, which is a different kind of less complex interaction. Telepresence also is always partial, and I'm not just talking about, you know, that you can see me from my shoulders to my head only, but even the sound of my voice is different than it would be in real life. The quality of my eye contact is different. No access to body language. So how do we work within what we call consistent partiality? The function of holding is democratized, and what I mean by democratized is that when we're working out of our own consulting rooms, we're responsible for creating that safe space there. We're responsible for containment. When we outsource that holding to our clients, they have to be responsible for the safer spaces that they're making. And in a sense, we can't just leave them to it. We have to work with them to make that space safe, both psychologically and emotionally, as well as physically. You know, can you be overheard? And the big take home that Gema also mentioned, and if you take one thing home from this meeting today, it is that working online is not the functional equivalence of co-present therapeutic work or social work. So functional equivalence simply meaning it is a different function that is happening. It's still therapy, it's still social work, but it's not the same. You're not replacing one activity for the other. You're not moving a face-to-face encounter online. It seems obvious, but really most people are operating as if that's the case. They've changed very little about their practice other than that they've moved online. And I'm going to be telling you why you really shouldn't be doing that as much as you're able to. So usually it's the therapist's role to maintain the holding environment, and with online counseling, it has to be the patient. So how are we managing our patients' safer spaces? So I'm going to cut right to the chase and talk about video conferencing. We can't all be as good at it as Captain Jean-Luc Picard. If there are any other Trekkies out there like me, you know, he's sort of the master of diplomacy on his on screen. Obviously, they have less partiality then. You can see their whole bodies, which helps, and they probably don't pixelate and have as many tech difficulties as we have, so we can't have it be perfect. But what do we want to be thinking about when we're doing video conferencing? So I'm going to be talking to you today about some practicalities, because if you don't get the practicalities right, you can't hold the psychological space. And I'm also going to be talking about the psychological space, but obviously in a pretty abbreviated way. So what you should be thinking about, and I'm talking, my work is mostly with therapists. I know that a lot of people will be social workers and will be in other kind of mental health and family support. So you have to just kind of reinterpret this information and what would work for you. So first off, on your side, in the rooms that you're in, is your workspace private and confidential? Can you be overheard? If you have a shared house, do you have a system so that somebody knows not to come into the room? With Post-it note on the door or a tie around the doorknob or something like that? Has this been discussed in the household? How is your screen hygiene? So think about the screen hygiene that we were talking about just in setting up this meeting, right? Is your email server on? Are you having sessions with your clients where you see bubbles of new emails coming in or WhatsApp messages? Have you shut down everything on your screen so that the only thing that you're looking at is the client or family that you're speaking to, so you're not distracted? Have you considered, and this, people don't think about this, it's really important, the lighting, placement, your comfort, what you're wearing, your needs? Do you have your glass of water nearby as you normally would, or your cup of tea and your tissues if you need them? It's hard enough to do online work, to hear people properly. So make it easier, right? Make sure that you're not in a messy environment. Make sure that you're physically comfortable. Make sure that your tech things are covered, right? So that your clients can hear you. You might need a microphone. You might need headphones. You don't want them straining to look at you. So you want to make sure that you're lit up well, and you don't want to be straining to listen to them or see them. So there might need to be a conversation. I can't see you well, or I can only see the top of your head, or maybe you think about, you know, how you set it up so you ease all of these basic expectations, so you're not spending energy worrying or focusing or trying to listen, right? So it's basically like a technological Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That lower part of the pyramid should be, I need to be able to hear you, you need to be able to hear me, we should be able to see each other, and people in our houses shouldn't be able to overhear us as best as possible. Amanda will probably cover this more than me, but you know, all of the other details around, you know, data compliance, GDPR, insurance, emergency contacts, particularly if the people you're working online with aren't in the same sort of geo-local locale as you are. Geo-local locale, same place, I think would be an easier way to say that. So on the client side, we need to be thinking also, what are the practical concerns there? So do you know that they're operating in a safe place? Is this something that you've discussed? And if they can't find that space, are you making some kind of an assessment about what kind and if therapy should even be happening? Because if you're putting your person in danger by continuing therapy when they're not in a safe space, you're not doing them any favors. Have you discussed in details the tech needs? You know, is it better that they speak to you over Google Chrome, for example, over something else? Have you chosen the right video conferencing software? Do you have a plan B? When the tech inevitably drops out, do they have a landline they can call you on? Are they going to call you, or are you going to call them? Have you planned this in advance so that you're not caught out in the middle? Have you spoken to them about their screen hygiene? So you may have closed down all your windows like a good therapist or counselor. Do they have their emails opened up? Are they looking at spreadsheets at the same time that they're talking to you? Are they, you know, are they watching Netflix? We don't know, but we have to kind of try and take some responsibility with them for that. What is your client doing before and after sessions? If they're moving from a team meeting on Zoom to a therapy session to another team meeting on Zoom, is this the best way to hold a therapy session? We need to move in and out of these experiences. Think about the physical concerns. So this is the functional equivalence again. We know from a lot of research now that video conferencing causes fatigue. So if you tend to set up your clinical day with 15-minute sessions, 10-minute breaks in between, and you have 4 clients in the morning and 4 in the afternoon with a small lunch break, that may be an inappropriate way to work when you're video conferencing, that you may have to change those periods. You may need longer breaks. You may need to reconsider the time of your sessions, you know, and I know that this is challenging, particularly for people who are quite dogmatic about their position on change and consistency. But again, we have to acknowledge that the context is different, and we're not working in a consulting room. So we have to be flexible, but we have to be critical about the ways in which we're being flexible. We need to understand that we're relying more on verbal communication, and all of us know that, you know, more than 80% of the communication happens non-verbally. So we're using a different part of our brain to listen to cognitions, to thoughts, to words, which is part of the reasons why we get tired. We're losing a lot of the social and emotional signals that we get when we're outside of partiality. However, on the contrary side, we're often looking closer at people's faces. So actually micro expressions, emotional expressions in faces becomes more available to us. Anybody familiar with Ekman's work? That's really interesting because you can see these micro expressions in ways that maybe we can't in co-present work. I've spoken to dozens of therapists who have changed their chair and have been in a state of bliss ever since, because they moved from their comfortable chair in their consulting room to an office chair in front of their computer. You're still doing talking therapy, right? So think about these things, make yourself comfortable. Don't, you know, it's hard enough. So what changes can you make to make it easier for yourself? Other simple things like getting up and moving between sessions. We also need to be thinking about things like the consequences of prolonged eye contact, which is pretty unnatural for a 50-minute session or an hour session, how you compensate or not for the lack of richness of relational complexity. Continuous partial attention is different from partiality. That's more like moving from one task to the next. So that's related to the screen hygiene stuff. And it's also related to how you set up your sessions. So if you're distracted going into a session, that's going to decrease the quality of that session. It's also the same for your client or your patient. If they're coming out, again, of a work meeting, they will be distracted. And these are all of the things that maybe we're not thinking about when we're not thinking about functional equivalence, right? What were you doing just before? What are you going to be doing after? Checking in about embodiment. It's much more difficult online. So some additional findings from a whole variety of different research, also the memorability of sessions, and this is very interesting. Not only when working online do we tend to forget that we've scheduled sessions more often, so you might miss a session or your client might miss a session, even if it's in the calendar. But what happens in a session is also more easily forgotten. So when you're asked to reflect on what happened last week, it's harder when that's been an online session. And some people may be compensating for that by taking more notes. Partiality we've covered. Residual trust is a really interesting one for people who work face-to-face for some period of time and then move into online work. Residual trust is kind of like bringing containment with you, right? So you can remember what it was like to be in that room with the other person and kind of hold on to that containment. It's transferable for a period of time, but it kind of runs out of steam after a while. We hope that this crisis will be over before that happens. But people who tend to move into online work more regularly, it's advisable to try at least to have face-to-face sessions every now and then to keep an embodied sense of containment going on. How we manage the embodiment of ourselves and our clients. And again, I'm throwing these ideas out there. We could spend half a day on each of them, but it's just things for you to be thinking about. And the risk of increased frame breaking also. So coming to sessions late, letting sessions go on, people coming into the room, dogs jumping into laps, all of that kind of stuff. So what we did, and this is all available freely online through our website, is we ran a year's research project talking to our therapists about basically their embodied experiences of working online and what their concerns were. Again, this is a much longer presentation out of which I've just pulled out the main themes rather than a lot of the kind of qualitative material that comes with those themes, which really bears reading because I think you'll probably identify with a lot of it. The thing that came up probably the most was therapists containing anxiety about managing the technology themselves. So when the sound goes, when the connection is dropped out, the anxiety rises very highly in the therapist because they feel that they're responsible for that space as much as they feel that they're responsible for the space in their own consulting room, and can be overly apologetic and can be overly concerned in a sense, because generally from the client side, notwithstanding different individuals, they're accustomed to that. They're accustomed to knowing that the technology is going to break down. We as therapists tend to be much more precious about holding a safe space, right? And we should be, but we can't maintain a safe that's safer than what our technology can allow. So in a sense, we have to give ourselves a little bit of a break because that anxiety makes us less good listeners, basically. Another interesting theme that came up was this idea about the sacred and the profane. So the idea was, gosh, well, when you're doing therapy, it's like the most sacred thing in the world. And then you do it on your laptop where people are doing their taxes, having their meetings, watching pornography, doing their entertainment, playing games. It's like mixed in with all of this, profane stuff. Should we be doing this? And this is really the argument when you could do both, of therapists are saying it's too precious to move into the profane space of online. What we found interestingly is it's the banality that's the problem, not the profanity, right? That is the same space that you're doing your email is the problem, not that it's the same space that somebody might be watching pornography, right? So it kind of delegates therapy to a computer-based activity like QuickBooks, right? Now, it's really not that bad, but we have to kind of make these distinctions for ourselves. So understand that you're operating across a banal platform, and it's not like coming into a room where you've taken great care to lay it out, for deep therapy work or social work or whatever it is that you're doing. Silences are more difficult to bear online. So we tend to compensate by talking too much or asking too many questions, right? So we need to be aware of our compensation. And maybe that's also about being more explicit than we would normally be by saying something like, hey, it's hard to be quiet when we're in a video meeting, but it's okay. We can sit in silence, to make permission for that kind of a thing. What do you need to think about around the ideas of forgettability of meetings and dismissibility, meaning that dismissibility is like ghosting people. A client might get uncomfortable and, suddenly accidentally the power goes out or the Wi-Fi goes out. It's much more difficult to walk out of a therapy room than it is to click out of a session. And then thinking again about this, that we call it the psychoanalytic third, or the holding environment or containment, how you can kind of address that. So again, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but we can make this available to you, and there is lots of stuff online. But in summary of the research that we've done and other stuff, what you should be keeping in mind as you're working is always remember that it's not a functional equivalent, and that you have to be prepared to be flexible to make decisions based on how you're delivering your service. It is not the same service delivered across a computer. Be mindful of that facilitating environment. How can you make it better? How can you hold silences? How can you reduce your own anxiety so that you can make a therapeutic meeting across video conferencing different from every other meeting that's going on WhatsApp, Zoom, or Skype with friends and family, office workers, colleagues, that sort of thing. We still want the therapeutic space to be different, so we have to create some markers to enable that. Embodied experience is lesser, right? So we're looking at image and sound. So do we need to bring that in more explicitly to how, what does it feel like below your shoulders, which is all I can see? Are you embodied? What does it feel like in your body? Continuous partial attention, turning off all those windows, screen hygiene, making sure that you're focused on your client alone. Being more explicit about the implicit scenario. We're working online now. What does that mean for us? What kind of decisions do we make? What do we need to be doing before and after a session to make sure it counts more? Managing your own overcompensation, stopping yourself from asking too many questions, allowing yourself to have some space. Also overcompensating for your anxiety about whether the tech works or whether the tech fails. A really important one, dealing with missed or disrupted now moments. So what happens when the feeling is high in a session and then you lose the sound, or then the connection goes out? How do you recover that? And do you have a plan? So for example, that happens in the last 10 minutes of a session and somebody's really left uncontained, right? This is why it's so important. I don't want to rev it down your throats, but the functional equivalence thing, right? So if really you're in a consulting room and an emergency emotional moment happens, you may be making some concessions, well, let's see each other next week, or let's see if we can extend the session, or whatever decision you would make. You need to be ready to be able to contain that now moment equally in a functionally unequivalent way. And again, allow yourself to be creative with the frame. So bring your critical capacity to bear, make good clinical choices, but be flexible. And I think I'm also going to say, and we can talk about this in discussion, can we bring this flexibility forward so that we can actually rethink how we deliver services after COVID in ways that are more flexible and amenable to people's needs, rather than our own attachment to the boundaries that we're comfortable and used to. And that's it for my presentation. So I'll unshare my screen and then we can have a discussion after.
Aaron, thank you very much. It was absolutely fascinating. And, I was sort of trying to keep it all in my mind and remembering just how I've defended against actually having to make this a thing that isn't functionally equivalent. I'm thinking of my chair. I'm thinking of how to manage these things that really in a way that I've just sort of lazily and defensively moved, just pretended it's the same thing and it isn't. And that's been really, really helpful for me. Thank you so much. We're going to now turn to Amanda. And Amanda Tayler-Beswick is a social work academic who within the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University in Belfast. Now, previous to her academic career, Amanda was a psychiatric social worker in Northern Ireland, specialising in community mental health and services for deaf people. It was Amanda's interest in the development of creative teaching methodologies, ones that can engage students in a dynamic, meaningful and informative manner, that brought her to England in social work education. Amanda's main research interests are in the area of digitalization and professional education. In particular, how social work education socializes students for practice in an emergent and complex digital social world. Being prepared when actually, how prepared can any of us be? Well, some of Amanda's recent projects include an examination of the contribution of social work education to the preparedness of students for practice in the connected age. And she's an academic advisor to a project investigating the digital capabilities of social workers in England in order to improve practice in this area. Dr. Tayler-Beswick is also interested in the ethical development and use of technologies and is a board member of HACITA, I think that's how you pronounce it, but you will correct me, I'm sure, Amanda, which is the Human Services Information Technology Association. One of the aims of this organization is to promote and support the development of innovative, effective, and ethical human service technology applications. And Amanda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I'll just share my screen. Thank you very much for the introduction and the welcome. And Aaron, I very much enjoyed your talk as well, and find it hard to move into my own space because I'm processing all that information, which confirms a lot of the things that you were saying about that translation into the digital space. So my talk will be brief and also, like Aaron said, trying to pack in 13 or 14 years of thinking into 15 minutes or shorter perhaps. But I wanted to kind of think about this or share this space with you all in terms of the things that have been on my mind pre the pandemic, the pandemic phase that we're in now. I'm thinking about post-pandemic, which Aaron and Nicola and Gema have also have made reference to. And some of the things that will cross over. Aaron's work has been very specific around the clinical practice. I thought I would talk about it a bit more broadly and bring it into the mix, things about digital platforms, digitalization of the social world, and what that means more broadly for us as social type workers. And I know that everybody's not specific to social work in this space, but that's my background, so I will draw kind of on some of those experiences. So, pre the pandemic, there we were, doing our thing in social type work where proximity was something that we took for granted and something that we relied on and continue to rely on quite a lot. Aaron's points around space and place and how that translates are really, really interesting and really important to hang on to in the broader thinking around how reliant we are on those types of methods, and also the point about how do we go forward, which I will cover in some ways too. So pre the pandemic, I was spending a lot of time with social type practitioners, professionals, thinking about how do we work in terms of contemporary societies who are very much online. They exist not only in physical spaces, and that was actually very difficult in lots of different ways, because social work in particular has a very troublesome relationship with technologies. Technologies in some ways were designed and forced upon social workers in a way that meant that it became a chore rather than a support or something that would help them do their job or enhance practices. Where in other parts of the world, this is more UK centric, in other parts of the world that was slightly different. In the US, for instance, clinical practice online has been going on for a very long time, as has the education of practitioners and clinicians been solely and wholly online for a very long time. So we come into this phase as social type practitioners, social workers, and are very disturbed in lots of ways about this need to be physically distant. I'll just move on these slides. We're in this space where we have to stay apart in terms of risk to the other, to ourselves and from other people. And it's not familiar in terms of human services professionals' ways of being, ways of practicing. But we do then need to reconsider, in an essence, the pandemic upended everything that we do, everything that was familiar to us in terms of how we, and also familiar to the people that we would work with. And even though most of us largely are online in some respect, to do professional work online is particularly problematic. And that's why, in pre-pandemic terms, social workers would say things like, I'm a high touch, not a high tech person. And this idea of I came into social care or social type work, human services type work, to work with people, not computers. And here we are forced into this space where actually we have to rely on the technologies much more than we ever perhaps would have wanted to. And we're trying to navigate all that type of kind of dynamic that Aaron was talking about, and also then things like platform choices. And I thought a good way for me to unpack that a bit more would be to talk about what has happened to me in my practices since the pandemic hit. And that was really being overwhelmed by the number of organisations, colleagues who have reached out to say, can you help? I need some help with this. I need help to think this out. We don't know how to use technology. We don't know things we should be considering. We've not been prepared for this. And that's where my research sort of came to life in lots of different ways, because that's what I found, that professional education and clinical education in the UK particularly was not preparing practitioners for practice in the digital world. And I'm talking this in terms of there are layers to this. There's a technical layer when we talk about using digital technologies. There's a professional layer when we talk about being professional or professional practices. And the practice layer is very much about that translation into the digital spaces, or using digital tools, or being mediated in our practices. And that idea of mediating our practices has not been comfortable. We haven't found those to be comfortable spaces. There's perceptions about this idea of face-to-face being real, in-person being real. But at the moment, I can assure you that I am real, I'm in person, and I'm face-to-face. I am mediated, for sure. And at the minute, it's really hard for me because I'm not getting any responses. The only person I can really see on the screen is Nicola on my slides. So I'm getting some responses and affirmations from Nicola that help me to kind of think, okay, this is going okay. But it's actually quite different in terms of what I would do when I'm teaching 200 students in a lecture theatre. So the idea of mediated, I think we need to reconceptualise in lots. And I think Aaron's contributions to that have been really, really helpful, really grounding in terms of the things that we should be mindful of, but also the things we shouldn't dismiss in terms of what we bring. But what my research has found, and I can share the links to that after this or through Nicola and Gema and colleagues, is that a lot of it is around preparedness, but a lot of it is also around perception, how we perceive things to be, and also the fact that our digital usage, our personal digital usage, does not always and appropriately translate into the professional spaces. That how we use technologies in a personal sense isn't always going to work very well or appropriately. Particularly, we have found this in social care, and you'll have seen perhaps the various times when social workers have been called to account for particularly getting it wrong online. So those are things to hold in mind as well. This idea of my translation of the digital capabilities that I have and the skills that I have, and how easily or not they translate into professional practices and into professional or clinical spaces. So I just want to share this example of one piece of work I've done recently with an organisation in the UK called New Beginnings, a community interest company. They're based in Greater Manchester. It's led by Dr. Yadviga Lee, who's the Director of Social Work in Lancaster University. And New Beginnings is based on Yadviga's research, working with parents in pre or proceedings, children of families, who are experiencing things where they may need to reconsider parenting choices. They do intensive group work with these parents who are referred in or who can self-refer in. And Yadviga reached out based on the fact that this group work happens twice a week. They were mid-group work, and they also offer one-to-one face-to-face type support as well. They were concerned, and the women were concerned. It was women particularly in this group, although they do have referrals from fathers and men as well. And they wanted to know, given that lockdown had come into effect almost immediately as when they contacted me, what will we do? How are we going to continue our service, provide our service in the online using digital tools? Can you help us think this out? And a lot of this thinking out was, there was a technical element in terms of data. Would the women have data? How can we get them data, machines, the hardware, iPads or whatever it might be? How can we create environments where they're able to come into the space and concentrate, the things that Aaron was talking about, other things going on in the background? Have they got the technologies, the bandwidth, all these sorts of things? And also, what technologies did the team need, and what technologies would the team or skills need, or the team need in terms of technological skills? So we had a long conversation about this in terms of getting funding for data, Wi-Fi, technologies for the children to keep the children, you know, give them something to do when they were homeschooling. So the environment was more conducive to the parents coming into the space and benefiting from the therapeutic space that they create at New Beginnings. And I'm really pleased to say that they wrote this blog about it, and I've vlogged about it as well, my experience of it, because I think it's useful to hear different people's experiences of these spaces and this translation. And this blog we can share with you after as well, and the vlog. But I just wanted to share this with you. This is one parent's view of what occurred in terms of the experience, and it from what I can take from speaking to Jadwiga reflectively after this, that this was the experience of most of the people in the group. So since we have moved into the online, this parent says, I've liked it. I think it might be better than before because everyone is getting to talk more than when they were sat together. I think some of this reflects Gema's experiences of the work they've been doing in Anna Freud as well. People are saying more than they used to, which may be because the girls, they're referring to the other women in the group, are feeling more comfortable or being in their own home rather than the community centre. So there's something for us to think about in terms of the environment. You know, some of our perceptions perhaps about going into the online or working through mediated or having mediated experiences, working with digital tools, you know, it may be as us as practitioners are bringing those projections to the space rather than going into the space and trialing the space out. So I wonder, you know, and I've been thinking a lot about this and about how we move other people into this kind of liminal space where they can think about this and not be troubled by it. Because initially when we had this conversation, we were all very troubled about how this would work out and troubled about the space, troubled about the technology. But actually, and Aaron made reference to this, about there's something about falling into the space. You know, this is not to say that we just become chaotic and just see how it goes, or, you know, sail by the skin of our teeth kind of thing. This is about, it is much different than that, but it's also about recognizing that this space is like any other environment. You know, we can do as much as we can to mitigate problems that may happen in the space, but we also have to allow the space to be as well and to be in that space. And there's lots of learning has come from this. So I think the thing for me that it was most interesting about this parent's comment was, I think it might be better than before. And I think that's something for us to pull apart in terms of our practices going forward. Why would that have been the case? And when I spoke to Yad after this and the team, much of this was about what they call Creative Commons. You know, they talk about, I'll just go back here, ordinary magic they talk about is created in their group. And I think that's group work theory. I think that's commonality of need. I think that's when a group is working really well, this idea of ordinary magic can occur and does occur for people because of the context that we create. So I think there is something about, yes, we need to be mindful of the technologies and creating the technologies that they work and all those different things, but also to have faith in the skills that we bring in terms of our group work or individual practices that I think are also very significant. Lots of people will know that I really like technologies. I maybe not like them as much as Aaron because I've never watched Doctor Who or any of those things, or Star Trek or any of that. Sorry, Aaron. But I do really like technologies and gadgets. But people interpret that I would prefer to be using these in terms of my practices. And really, I wouldn't. I would rather be in a lecture theatre with 200 students interacting and feeling that presence in that particular way and that physicality than I would be mediated. But in this, you know, in the circumstances we are, this mediated experience is something that we need to do, but also something we need to learn from in terms of how we go forward. And that's kind of what I wanted to sort of move into and move on with and kind of finish on. That about, yeah, in 2015, I was reading the work of the Suskins. The Suskins are a father and son authorship that wrote this book about the future of the professions. And some of the things that I was saying back then around social work in particular was, you know, about us taking control of our own future. And the pandemic in some ways has driven that forward, probably in a useful way for me, from my point of view, because we've been saying this. There's a 33-year literature base through Hosida, Nicola mentioned earlier, where we, in the 70s, social work, a group of social workers started up Hosida to talk about, you know, the use of technology for good. And they were urging us to think about technologies, but also about the problems with technologies as we go forward. So there's a couple of things there to think about as well. You know, our future in terms of what do the people that we work with want? What does 21st century practice look like? What does it feel like? How is it mediated? How much is it mediated? How much is it physical? These are all things I think that are up for discussion right now. The danger of this all is, and this is, you'll not be surprised by this slide probably, this is not a slant against Mark Zuckerberg, not really, but this is about to think about the dominance of particular voices and people and platforms and technologies. And what we do now as practitioners in the spaces that we bring people into, thinking really carefully about their digital data profiles. Virginia Eubank is the book here on the screen that I would really urge people to read when they're thinking about moving into these media spaces. Not just because that we're working in this way, but also because automation is becoming more and more problematic in our world because it's not regulated, it's not governed, not the way it should be. We have all fallen into these persuasive type spaces, not through our own fault, but because they're very convenient and we choose. I say choose convenience over consciousness, but I think in some ways that pervasiveness has, or persuasiveness has been so pervasive that we have fallen into these ways of being that don't fit easily with our futures as data beings. And we are very much going to be data beings every second of every day from quite a long time now into our futures. And I say to practitioners when I'm teaching this, it doesn't matter. Data doesn't matter until it does. Our data profiles do not matter until they do. And we might say, well, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on this, I'm not on the other thing. I'll probably guarantee that we all are, because somebody else will have done us the luxury to invite us or post us in those spaces. We are everywhere. Data profiles are being, and data is being generated. Even now in this space, we are generating data, but we took the decision to use Teams over Zoom in this situation because when we looked into the under the hood, as my friend Helen Tara would say, we felt it was a more ethical data space to be in terms of what data would be collected about us coming into the space, which in Teams respect, it's just, or I'd say just, but it's our email address that they just use for functionality of the platform rather than selling and marketing us as and our data really. And that's where I'm getting to with this in terms of how we go forward in this post-pandemic kind of situation, that we will go post-pandemic at some point. What our profession is going to look like? I think we need to have control of that, or some control of that. So these are my questions for myself and for us all, really. What will we take forward in terms of digital practices? What will we leave behind in terms of traditional practices, but also digital practices? And who will decide? That is really key for me. I think we should decide about our own futures when it comes to digitalization as professionals, and I think part of that is the ethical premises that we work on, and that's about keeping people safe. And I think we need to think really carefully about the technology we use, the platforms that we choose, and the implications, more particularly for the people that we work with and for as we go forward in the future, because their data profiles are the ones that are more likely to be surveyed and more likely to be scrutinized. And we're seeing that very much through the Black Lives Matters campaigns, and also the Me Too campaigns, the various campaigns that have started to emerge, thankfully, because these populations that we generally work with, our fellow humans, are very much, and us too, you never know the potential for your data to be misused, are going to find it very, very difficult. Much more difficult than we do now as populations and societies and communities to navigate the world based on the information that is being collated about us every single moment of every single day. And I think for us as human services practitioners, that we need to be really informing society because of what John Naughton talks about, that we've become critically dependent on technologies that we really don't understand. In fact, the chair of Google himself said that humanity have built something that, in terms of technologies, that humanity just do not understand. So I'm wondering, should we draw a line in our sand really here and talk about and go forward as a profession, thinking about technologies through a social justice lens, So thank you for listening, and I hope that's been useful. I'm really, really keen to hear your thoughts, because this knowledge generation space is going to be really helpful as we do move forward. So thank you, colleagues, for listening, but thank you, Anna Freud, for inviting me into the space.
And thank you very much for giving us so much to think about, Amanda. You know, and I was very struck again from both Aaron and your talk, how one does have to fall into the space, how one has to give up one's rigid preconceptions of how things ought to be, or what is better and what is worse, in order to be able to move forward. But also I was struck, and it felt quite exhausting to me, is that we're actually holding more than just the space in the therapeutic encounter, but the technological space, that we have an overriding responsibility to protect our clients on so many levels. So I was very struck by that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.